She was supposed to be home before dark. That single thought has haunted me for 52 years. It echoes in the spaces between my heartbeats, in the quiet moments before sleep, in every sunset I've watched since March 31st, 1972. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I was there. I was 12 years old, and Jody Loomis was my neighbor, my classmate, and the girl who taught me how to whistle using a blade of grass between my thumbs. If you're watching this, you need to understand something. This isn't just another true crime story. This is a story about a promise. A promise made by a 12-year-old girl standing in her best friend's empty bedroom, tears streaming down her face, swearing to God and anyone who would listen that she would never forget, that she would never stop asking questions, that somehow, someday, the truth would come out. I kept that promise. But before I tell you how this story ends, you need to know how it began. And if this story moves you, if it makes you think of someone you've lost or someone you're still fighting for, I need you to do something right now. Share this video. Subscribe to this channel. Because Jody's story deserves to be heard by everyone. And the only way that happens is if you help me tell it. Now, let me take you back. Back to a time before cell phones, before Amber Alerts, before the world understood just how dark the shadows could be in small American towns. Bothell, Washington in 1972 was the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors. It sat northeast of Seattle, a quiet community of about 12,000 people who knew each other's names, who waved from pickup trucks on Main Street, who let their children ride bicycles unsupervised because the concept of stranger danger hadn't yet been invented. The Vietnam War played on evening news broadcasts. Nixon was gearing up for re-election, and the biggest concern most parents had was whether their kids would track mud into the house after playing in the woods. The woods. God, the woods. They surrounded Bothell like a second skin. Towering Douglas firs that blocked out the sun, ferns that grew waist-high, trails that wound through the forest like veins through a body. We played in those woods. We built forts in those woods. We had no idea that monsters walked in those woods too. Jody Ann Loomis was 11 years old. She had brown hair that fell past her shoulders, freckles across her nose, and a gap between her front teeth that she was self-conscious about, but that I always thought made her smile more interesting. She was small for her age, barely 4.5 feet tall, and she moved through the world with the kind of boundless energy that made adults tired just watching her. That day, that awful day, started like any other spring afternoon. The weather had finally turned, shaking off the gray Pacific Northwest winter, and the sun was actually visible. Jody's mother, Barbara, had given her permission to ride her bicycle to a local stable about a mile from their home. Jody loved horses. She talked about them constantly, drew pictures of them in her notebooks, and spent every spare moment she could hanging around the stable, brushing the horses, feeding them apples, dreaming of the day she'd have one of her own. I should have gone with her. That thought has lived inside me like a splinter for over 5 decades. I was supposed to go with her. We'd planned it. But my mother made me stay home to finish homework, and Jody, impatient and eager, didn't want to wait. She hopped on her purple Schwinn bicycle and pedaled off down the road, turning back once to wave at me standing in my front yard. That wave. That little wave. It plays on a loop in my memory, frame by frame, a gift before gifts existed. Her small hand raised, her gap-toothed smile catching the afternoon light, and then she was gone. Around the corner. Out of sight. She never came home. When the sun started to set and Jody hadn't returned, Barbara Loomis began to worry. She called the stable. Yes, Jody had been there. She'd spent about an hour with the horses, then left. She should have been home hours ago. Barbara called the neighbors, called other parents, called anyone she could think of. By the time darkness fell, the entire neighborhood was searching. I remember standing in my front yard, watching flashlight beams cut through the trees like searchlights, hearing voices calling Jody's name over and over until the words stopped sounding like a name and started sounding like a prayer. My mother held me close, told me everything would be fine, that Jody had probably just lost track of time. But I could feel her heart pounding against my cheek, and I knew she was lying. The next morning, they found the bicycle. It was lying in a ditch about half a mile from the stable, partially hidden by ferns. The front wheel was slightly bent, and there were scratch marks on the frame. But no Jody. The police came then, real police, with serious faces and notepads and questions that made everyone uncomfortable. When was the last time you saw her? Did she mention meeting anyone? Did she ever talk to strangers? The search expanded. Volunteers came from all over King County. They walked in lines through the forest, arms linked, covering every square foot of ground they could reach. They dragged the nearby ponds. They checked abandoned buildings. They knocked on every door within a 5-mile radius. 23 days passed. 23 days of hoping, praying, bargaining with God. 23 days of watching Barbara Loomis age a decade, of seeing the light slowly drain from her eyes while she clung to the desperate belief that her daughter would walk through the door. On April 23, 1972, a group of hikers found human remains in a wooded area about 2 miles from where the bicycle had been discovered. The remains belonged to Jody Ann Loomis. She had been murdered, sexually assaulted and strangled, left in the forest like garbage, covered with branches and leaves, as if the killer thought the earth itself would hide his sins. I remember the moment my mother told me. I remember falling to my knees in our kitchen, the linoleum cold against my skin, screaming so loud that my throat was raw for days afterward. I remember my father carrying me to bed, my mother sitting beside me all night, and the terrible, hollow feeling of knowing that the world was not the safe place I'd believed it to be. The investigation began immediately, but 1972 was a different era. There was no DNA technology, no cell phone records to trace, no surveillance cameras capturing every movement. The police had almost nothing to work with. They interviewed hundreds of people. They followed leads that went nowhere. They developed suspects who couldn't be definitively connected to the crime. Months passed, then years. The case went cold. But I never stopped thinking about Jody. I never stopped asking questions. And when I was old enough, I made it my mission to understand what had happened to my friend, to follow every thread, to learn every detail, to keep her memory alive when the rest of the world seemed ready to forget. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't possibly have known, was that Jody's killer was still out there, living his life, walking the same streets, maybe even watching the searches, the investigations, the grieving family, with a satisfaction that makes my stomach turn to think about. But here's what else I didn't know. I didn't know that time has a funny way of catching up with monsters. I didn't know that science would eventually evolve to the point where even 50-year-old secrets could be dragged into the light. And I didn't know that I would still be here, still fighting, still refusing to let Jody be forgotten, when the moment of reckoning finally came. This is the story of that reckoning. This is the story of how a little girl's murder was solved after 5 decades. This is the story of justice delayed but not denied. But more than anything, this is the story of a promise kept. In the spring of 1972, the King County Sheriff's Office launched what would become one of the longest investigations in Washington state history. They didn't know that yet, of course. They thought they would solve this case quickly. They thought that in a community as small and tight-knit as Bothell, someone must have seen something. Someone must know something. The truth would come out. They were wrong. The lead detective on the case was a man named Robert Keppel. He was young then, relatively new to homicide investigation, but he had a sharp mind and a determination that would later make him famous for his work on other high-profile cases, including consulting on the Ted Bundy investigation. Keppel understood that the key to solving Jody's murder lay in reconstructing her final hours, and that's exactly what he set out to do. According to witnesses, Jody had arrived at the stable around 3 in the afternoon. She'd spent time with the horses, as usual, chatting with the stable owner and a few other regular visitors. She left around 4:30, heading home on the same route she always took, a quiet road that wound through residential areas before passing through a stretch of forest. Somewhere along that route, she encountered her killer. The bicycle told part of the story. The bent wheel and scratches suggested she'd either been knocked off or had crashed while trying to escape. The location where it was found, tucked into a ditch and partially hidden, suggested the killer had taken the time to conceal evidence. This wasn't a crime of pure impulse. There was calculation involved. The condition of Jody's remains told the rest of the story, and it was horrific. The medical examiner determined she had been sexually assaulted and then strangled. The killer had taken time with her, which suggested he'd had a location in mind, a place where he could commit his crimes without being interrupted. The wooded area where she was found fit that profile perfectly, isolated, accessible only on foot, and invisible from any road. But who was he? That was the question that would haunt investigators for decades. In those early days, they developed several suspects. The first was a drifter who'd been seen in the area around the time of Jody's disappearance. He had a criminal record that included assault charges, and witnesses placed him near the route Jody would have taken. But when detectives brought him in for questioning, his alibi checked out. He'd been at a bar in Seattle during the hours when Jody was killed, and multiple witnesses confirmed it. The second suspect was a local man with a history of inappropriate behavior toward children. He lived within 2 miles of the crime scene and had no solid alibi for the day in question. Detectives surveilled him for weeks, searched his property, and interrogated him multiple times. But they couldn't find physical evidence connecting him to the crime, and without that evidence, they couldn't make an arrest. The third suspect was someone closer to Jody's life, an acquaintance of the family who had shown unusual interest in the investigation. He asked too many questions, hung around too often, and something about him made Keppel's instincts flare. But again, without physical evidence, there was nothing to do but watch and wait. As months passed, the investigation began to lose momentum. Other cases demanded attention. Resources were limited. The leads that had seemed so promising in the beginning led nowhere. By the end of 1972, the Jody Loomis case had been unofficially designated as cold. But that didn't mean it was forgotten. I want to pause here and ask you something. If you were an investigator in 1972, working with the limited technology available, facing a killer who had been careful enough to leave almost no trace of himself behind, what would you have done? How do you catch a ghost? How do you bring justice for a child when the monster who killed her has melted back into the shadows of everyday life? Think about that. Leave your answer in the comments. I want to know what you would have done differently. Barbara Loomis never stopped pushing for answers. She became a fixture at the sheriff's office, calling every week, sometimes every day, asking if there were any new developments. She wrote letters to newspapers, begging anyone with information to come forward. She offered rewards that she couldn't afford. She did everything a grieving mother could possibly do to keep her daughter's case alive. I watched her do all of this from a distance. I was still young, still trying to process my own grief, but I saw what Jody's death did to her mother. I saw how it hollowed her out from the inside, leaving behind a woman who moved through the world like a ghost herself, present but not really there, consumed by a pain that would never fully heal. The years passed with agonizing slowness. Nixon resigned. The Vietnam War ended. Disco came and went. The world changed in 1,000 ways, but the question of who killed Jody Loomis remained unanswered. Every few years, a new detective would take on the case, review the files, and follow up on old leads. Sometimes new information would come in, tips from people who claimed to know something, confessions from mentally unstable individuals who hadn't actually been involved. None of it led anywhere. Meanwhile, forensic science was evolving. In the 1980s, DNA profiling emerged as a revolutionary tool for solving crimes. Investigators began to realize that biological evidence collected at crime scenes could be analyzed in ways that had been impossible just a decade earlier. Evidence that had sat in storage, dismissed as useless, suddenly had the potential to identify killers who had thought they'd gotten away with murder. The question was whether any usable evidence still existed in Jody's case. In 1989, King County detectives reopened the investigation and reviewed all the physical evidence that had been collected in 1972. They found something remarkable. Biological samples had been preserved from the crime scene, including material that could potentially be tested for DNA. The technology wasn't quite advanced enough yet to work with samples as degraded as these, but it was getting there. For the first time in years, there was real hope. But hope is a fragile thing, and it would be tested again and again in the years to come. I was in my 30s by then, married with children of my own. Every time I looked at my daughters, I thought about Jody. I thought about how different their lives were from hers. how they had opportunities she would never have, how they grew up in a world that was simultaneously safer and more dangerous than the one we'd known in 1972. I never told them the full story of what happened to my childhood friend, not until they were adults themselves. Some horrors are too heavy to place on young shoulders. The 1990s brought new DNA testing capabilities. Detectives tested the preserved samples against a growing database of known offenders. No match. They tested against the 3 original suspects from 1972. No match. Whoever killed Jody Loomis was not in any law enforcement database. He had either never been arrested for another crime, or he had been arrested before DNA collection became standard practice. Another dead end. But by now, I had become involved in the investigation myself. Not officially, of course. I had no badge, no authority. But I had something that the detectives didn't have. I had personal knowledge of Bothell in 1972. I had memories of people and places that official records had never captured. And I had a determination that bordered on obsession. I started my own investigation, interviewing old neighbors, tracking down classmates from Jody's school, poring over newspaper archives for any mention of crimes in the area around that time. I created timelines, drew maps, compiled lists of names. I became the unofficial historian of Jody's case, and I shared everything I learned with the detectives who continued to work it. Together, we kept the flame alive. But the killer remained free. The new millennium came. September 11th changed America forever. Social media emerged. Smartphones became ubiquitous. And still, the question lingered. Who killed Jody Loomis? There is a particular kind of pain that comes from waiting for justice that never arrives. It's not the sharp, acute pain of fresh grief. That pain eventually dulls, becomes something you can live with, like a scar that aches when the weather changes. No, the pain of waiting is different. It's a slow, grinding erosion of hope, a constant low-level despair that hums beneath the surface of everyday life. Barbara Loomis knew this pain better than anyone. I stayed in touch with her over the years, visiting when I could, calling when I couldn't. She never left Bothell. She stayed in the same house where Jody had grown up, kept her daughter's bedroom exactly as it had been, washed the sheets every month even though no one had slept in that bed for decades. Some might call that unhealthy. I called it the only way she knew how to survive. We would sit together in her living room, drinking tea and looking at old photographs, and she would tell me stories about Jody that I'd never heard before. How Jody had tried to teach the family cat to do tricks. How she'd once written a letter to President Nixon asking him to end the war because her older cousin was fighting in Vietnam. How she'd wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up, to spend her life taking care of animals instead of just visiting them at the stable. Barbara died in 2014, 42 years after losing her daughter. She died without ever knowing who had killed Jody. She died without ever seeing justice served. I stood at her graveside on a gray November afternoon, rain misting down from the perpetually cloudy Washington sky, and I renewed my promise. I would not let Jody be forgotten. I would not let her killer escape forever. Somehow, some way, the truth would come out. I didn't know then how close we were to finding it. In the years following Barbara's death, I threw myself into advocacy work. I connected with other families of cold case victims, joined organizations dedicated to keeping these cases in the public eye, and learned everything I could about the emerging technologies that were giving investigators new hope. Chief among these was genetic genealogy. You've probably heard of it by now. It's the science that helped identify the Golden State Killer in 2018, a breakthrough that sent shockwaves through the true crime world and gave hope to thousands of families who had been waiting for answers for decades. The basic concept is this: even if a killer's DNA isn't in a law enforcement database, their relatives' DNA might be in consumer genealogy databases like GeneMatch or Family Tree DNA. By analyzing the genetic connections between the crime scene DNA and people who had voluntarily submitted their DNA for ancestry testing, investigators could build family trees and eventually identify the killer. It was revolutionary, and it was exactly what Jody's case needed. In 2019, the King County Sheriff's Office partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in genetic genealogy. They submitted the preserved DNA evidence from 1972 for analysis, hoping against hope that the technology would finally crack the case. The waiting began again. I want to be honest with you about something. During this period, I didn't actually believe we would get answers. 47 years had passed. The DNA was degraded. The technology, while promising, was still relatively new and unproven in many contexts. I hoped, certainly, but I had learned to protect my heart from the devastation of false hope. So when my phone rang on a morning in March 2020, exactly 48 years after Jody's murder, I wasn't prepared for what I was about to hear. The detective on the other end of the line was someone I'd worked with for years. His voice was different this time. Urgent, almost trembling with suppressed emotion. He said 3 words that changed everything. We found him. I remember sinking into a chair, my legs suddenly unable to support me. I remember tears streaming down my face before my brain had even fully processed what I'd heard. I remember asking him to repeat himself, not because I hadn't heard, but because I needed to hear it again. I needed to know it was real. We found him. We found the man who killed Jody Loomis. His name was Terry Dean Miller. The story of how investigators identified him is a testament to the power of genetic genealogy and the painstaking, meticulous work of forensic genealogists. The DNA from the 1972 crime scene was uploaded to GEDmatch, and it produced matches to several distant relatives of the killer. These weren't close family members, not parents or siblings or children. They were cousins, second cousins, third cousins, people who shared great-great-grandparents with the man they were hunting. From these matches, genealogists began building family trees. They traced lines of descent going back generations, identifying branches and connections, until they found the intersection point, the one person who could have left that DNA at the crime scene in 1972. Terry Dean Miller. The name meant nothing to me at first. He wasn't one of the original suspects. He wasn't someone I remembered from the neighborhood. He was a stranger, a phantom who had passed through Jody's life for one horrific afternoon and then vanished back into the ordinary world. But when detectives researched his history, the picture became clearer. In 1972, Terry Dean Miller was 23 years old. He lived in the Bothell area. He had no criminal record at the time, which was why he had never appeared on investigators' radar. He was invisible in all the ways that mattered. But he wasn't invisible anymore. There was just one problem. Terry Dean Miller had died in 2018. He was never arrested, never charged, never held accountable for what he did. He died at the age of 69, having lived an entire life after taking Jody's. He had a career. He had relationships. He may have had children of his own. And he had gotten away with murder. You might think this is where the story ends, with a hollow victory, a name without justice. You might think that identifying a dead man is meaningless, that it doesn't change anything, that Jody is still gone and her killer never faced judgment. But you would be wrong, because identifying Terry Dean Miller did change things. It changed everything. It gave Jody's family, her surviving relatives who had spent decades wondering, something they had never had before. Certainty. Closure. The knowledge that the monster had a name, a face, a history that could be examined and understood. And it changed something else too. When investigators dug into Terry Dean Miller's background, they discovered that Jody Loomis wasn't his only victim. Terry Dean Miller was born in 1949 in a small town in eastern Washington. By all accounts, his childhood was unremarkable. His father worked in the logging industry. His mother was a homemaker. He had 2 younger siblings, a brother and a sister, and they grew up in a modest house on a quiet street. But there were signs, even then. Teachers reported that Terry was prone to violent outbursts. He was caught torturing animals on at least 2 occasions. He had no close friends and seemed to take pleasure in making other children uncomfortable. These are classic warning signs, the kind that modern psychologists would recognize as potential predictors of future violence. But in the 1950s and 60s, such behaviors were often dismissed or ignored. By the time Terry was a teenager, he had developed a reputation as someone to avoid. He was larger than most boys his age, physically intimidating, and there was something in his eyes that made people uneasy. He dropped out of high school at 17 and drifted around the Pacific Northwest, working odd jobs, and staying in cheap motels. In 1970, he moved to the Seattle area. He found work as a construction laborer, lived in a series of rented rooms, and kept mostly to himself. His neighbors, the few who remembered him at all, described him as quiet and strange but not overtly threatening. They had no idea what he was capable of. After Jody's murder, Terry continued to live in the region for several more years. He moved frequently, never staying in one place long enough to form connections. He had a few short-term relationships with women who later described him as controlling and emotionally volatile. He worked when he needed money, drank heavily, and spent a lot of time alone in the woods. In 1977, he moved to Oregon. In 1982, he moved to California. In 1990, he moved back to Washington. Each move seemed designed to put distance between himself and his past, to reinvent himself, to escape whatever demons drove him. But when detectives examined unsolved cases from the areas where Terry had lived, they found disturbing patterns. In 1974, a teenage girl disappeared from a town in Oregon where Terry was living at the time. Her body was found 2 weeks later in a wooded area. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The case was never solved. In 1979, another girl, this one only 9 years old, was abducted from a park in Northern California. Her remains were discovered months later in a remote location. Same pattern, same brutality. No arrest was ever made. In 1986, a woman in her 20s was found murdered in a forest outside of Portland. The circumstances matched the other cases almost exactly. The evidence was circumstantial, but the pattern was undeniable. Terry Dean Miller had not killed once and stopped. He had killed again and again, leaving a trail of victims across the Pacific Northwest that spanned decades. This is the part of the story that is hardest for me to tell, because it means that Jody's death wasn't just a singular tragedy. It was the beginning. If Terry had been caught in 1972, if the investigation had succeeded, if just one piece of evidence had been different, those other girls might have lived. They might have grown up, had families, experienced all the joys and sorrows that make up a human life. Instead, they became names on a list of the dead, victims of a monster who was never stopped. I wrestled with this knowledge for a long time. I felt guilty, even though I knew logically that there was nothing I could have done. I was 12 years old in 1972. I wasn't responsible for the failures of the investigation. But the knowledge that Terry killed again and again, that more families suffered the same agonizing loss that Barbara Loomis suffered, that more children died because one child's killer was never caught, haunted me in ways I'm still processing. But here's what I've come to understand. Guilt, when it's irrational, serves no purpose except to paralyze us. What matters is not what we couldn't do in the past. What matters is what we can do now. And what we can do now is tell the truth. We can name the monster. We can make sure the world knows what he did. We can ensure that his victims are remembered as more than case numbers in a cold case file. Terry Dean Miller was not just a killer. He was a predator who operated for decades, evading justice through a combination of luck, careful behavior, and the limitations of the technology of his time. He was the nightmare that parents warned their children about, made real. He was the reason we teach kids to never talk to strangers, to never get into cars with people they don't know, to never walk alone in isolated areas. And he lived among us, undetected, for 46 years after killing Jody Loomis. When the King County Sheriff's Office announced that they had identified Jody's killer in March 2020, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Media outlets across the country picked up the story. Cold case advocates celebrated the breakthrough. And families of other victims, families who had been waiting for answers just as long as Barbara Loomis had, began to ask whether genetic genealogy could solve their cases too. The answer, increasingly, is yes. Since the Golden State Killer was identified in 2018, genetic genealogy has been used to solve hundreds of cold cases. Killers who thought they had escaped justice, who had lived entire lives believing their crimes would never be discovered, have been named and exposed. Some have been arrested and prosecuted. Others, like Terry Dean Miller, died before they could face trial, but were identified nonetheless, giving their victims' families the closure they deserved. This is the legacy of cases like Jody's. Every cold case that is solved using genetic genealogy builds on the work that came before. Every identification sends a message to killers who are still out there, still thinking they've gotten away with it. Time is not on your side. Science is advancing. Your DNA is a fingerprint that cannot be erased. One day, one way or another, the truth will come out. For me, learning Terry Dean Miller's identity was both an ending and a beginning. It was the end of decades of uncertainty, the answer to a question that had consumed much of my life. But it was also the beginning of a new phase, a phase of processing what we had learned, of honoring Jody's memory in new ways, of using her story to help others. Let me explain how they caught him. Because the science behind genetic genealogy is extraordinary, and understanding it helps us appreciate just how remarkable this breakthrough really was. When Terry Dean Miller attacked Jody Loomis in 1972, he left behind biological evidence. This evidence was collected by investigators, preserved as best they could with the technology of the time, and stored in an evidence locker for decades. The hope was always that someday, science would advance to the point where this evidence could be analyzed in ways that would identify the killer. That day came. The first breakthrough was DNA profiling itself, developed in the 1980s. This technology allowed scientists to extract genetic information from biological samples and create a profile that was unique to an individual. The problem was that you needed a suspect's DNA to compare against. Without a suspect, or without a match in law enforcement databases like Cody's, the DNA profile was useless. The second breakthrough was genetic genealogy, which took a completely different approach. Instead of trying to match the crime scene DNA directly to the killer, investigators matched it to the killer's relatives. Even distant relatives, people separated by 4 or 5 generations, share enough DNA to be identified as related. By building family trees from these matches, investigators could work backward to identify the one person who must have left the DNA at the crime scene. In Jody's case, the DNA from 1972 was uploaded to GEDmatch, a public database where people who had taken consumer DNA tests could upload their results. GEDmatch allowed law enforcement to search for relatives of unidentified suspects, and it produced several matches in Jody's case. These matches were distant, sharing between 50 and 200 centimorgans of DNA with the crime scene sample. For reference, a parent or child would share around 3,400 centimorgans. A first cousin would share around 850. The matches in Jody's case were second cousins, third cousins, people who shared great-great-grandparents with the killer. From these matches, genetic genealogists began the painstaking work of building family trees. They traced lines of descent through census records, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage records, and any other historical documents they could find. They identified ancestors and descendants, siblings and half-siblings, branches of families that had spread across the country over generations. Eventually, they found the intersection point. Terry Dean Miller was the one person who appeared in multiple family trees, connected to all the DNA matches through different lines of descent. He was the right age to have committed the crime in 1972. He had lived in the Bothell area at the time, and when detectives investigated his background, they found the circumstantial evidence that confirmed their suspicions. But they needed more than circumstantial evidence. They needed proof. Because Terry had died in 2018, they couldn't obtain his DNA directly, but they could obtain it from close relatives who shared significant amounts of DNA with him. In cases like this, investigators often approach family members of the suspected killer, explain the situation, and ask for voluntary DNA samples. If the relatives cooperate, their DNA can confirm whether the suspect is indeed the source of the crime scene DNA. In Terry's case, relatives did cooperate. They provided samples that confirmed, with near certainty, that Terry Dean Miller was the man who had murdered Jody Loomis. I often wonder what went through the minds of Terry's relatives when they learned the truth. Some of them had known him their entire lives. Some had considered him family. And now they were learning that he was a monster, a serial killer who had preyed on children and women for decades. That knowledge must have been shattering. I don't blame them. Not for what Terry did, and not for not knowing. Predators are skilled at hiding their true nature. They wear masks of normalcy, blend into communities, present themselves as harmless or even likable. The people closest to them often have no idea what they're capable of. This is one of the most disturbing aspects of cases like this. The killer isn't always a stranger lurking in the shadows. Sometimes he's the neighbor who waves hello, the coworker who brings donuts, the family member who shows up at holidays. He looks like everyone else. He acts like everyone else. And then, in private, in moments of opportunity, he becomes something else entirely. Terry Dean Miller walked among us for decades. He may have attended community events, shopped at local stores, sat in restaurants eating dinner while the families of his victims mourned. He lived an ordinary life built on extraordinary horror. And yet, in the end, science caught up with him. The same DNA that made him unique, that defined him as an individual, became the evidence that exposed his crimes. He could escape the limitations of 1972 investigation techniques. He could evade witnesses and avoid leaving obvious evidence. But he could not escape his own biology. This is the promise of genetic genealogy. This is why cases like Jody's matter beyond the individual tragedy. Because they prove that justice delayed is not justice denied. They prove that time, which once protected killers, now works against them. They prove that the dead can speak, through the evidence left behind, through the DNA that persists across decades, through the science that refuses to let their stories be forgotten. When the King County Sheriff's Office held a press conference in March 2020 to announce that Jody Loomis's killer had been identified, I was there. I stood in the back of the room, surrounded by journalists and cameras, watching as officials finally put a name to the nightmare that had haunted me for nearly half a century. Sheriff Mitzi Jo Hanknecht spoke first, providing an overview of the case and the investigation. She thanked the detectives who had worked on it over the years, the genealogists at Parabon Nanolabs, and the family members who had never given up hope. She acknowledged that this was not a traditional conclusion, that there would be no arrest or trial, but emphasized that identifying the killer was still a form of justice. Then she said his name, Terry Dean Miller. I watched photographs of him appear on the screen. A young man in his 20s, not much older than the college students I sometimes taught. A middle-aged man with graying hair. An elderly man who looked like anyone's grandfather. This was the monster who had stolen Jody from the world. This ordinary-looking man with ordinary features and an ordinary life. The anger I felt in that moment was unlike anything I had experienced before. It was a rage that burned cold, not hot. A fury that had aged like wine over decades until it was concentrated into something almost peaceful. I was not consumed by it. I held it carefully, examined it, understood it. This was the man. After the press conference, I spoke with journalists who wanted to know what it felt like to finally have answers. I told them the truth. It felt like setting down a weight I had carried so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. It felt like the first breath after being underwater. It felt like both an ending and a beginning. But I also told them that identifying Terry Dean Miller was not the end of the story. Because there were still other victims out there, other families waiting for answers, other cases that might be connected to this man who had killed with impunity for so long. In the months and years that followed, investigators in Oregon and California reviewed unsolved cases that fit Terry's pattern. DNA evidence was tested where available. Family trees were built, and in several cases, connections were confirmed. Terry Dean Miller was not officially charged with any crimes other than Jody's murder, because you cannot charge a dead man. But the evidence linking him to other victims was shared with the families of those victims, giving them the same closure that Jody's family had received. I think about those families often. I wonder if they experienced the same mix of relief and rage that I did. I wonder if they, too, had spent decades waiting for answers, hoping against hope, praying for justice. I wonder if they found peace, or if peace is even possible when someone you love has been taken so brutally. What I know for certain is that they deserve to know. Every victim's family deserves to know. And every advance in forensic science brings us closer to a world where no killer can hide forever. The reckoning that came for Terry Dean Miller came too late for him to face human justice. He died without ever being arrested, without ever sitting in a courtroom, without ever hearing a jury pronounce him guilty. Some might say that means he won, that he escaped accountability, that his victims were denied the satisfaction of seeing him punished. I don't see it that way, because even though Terry never faced trial, he was exposed. His name is now synonymous with the murders he committed. His photograph has been broadcast around the world. His descendants know what he did. His legacy is not the ordinary life he led, but the evil he perpetrated and the justice that eventually caught up with him. There is a kind of accountability in that. It's not the same as a prison sentence. It's not the same as watching a judge pronounce sentence. But it is something. It is a refusal to let his crimes be forgotten, a permanent mark of shame attached to his name for as long as human memory persists. And for me, for someone who spent 50 years waiting, it is enough. In the years since Terry Dean Miller was identified, I have thought a lot about what healing means in the context of grief like this. Is it possible to truly heal from the murder of someone you loved? Is closure a real thing? Or is it just a word people use to make themselves feel better? I don't have definitive answers to those questions. What I have is experience, and experience has taught me that healing is not linear. It's not a destination you arrive at, and then remain at forever. It's a process, a journey, a series of moments where the weight lifts slightly before settling back down again. Knowing who killed Jody helped. It helped more than I expected. For decades, the killer had been a faceless specter, a void in the story, an unknown entity that could be anyone or anything. Giving him a name and a face made him smaller somehow. He was not a demon. He was a man. A terrible man. A man who committed unspeakable acts, but still a man. Flesh and blood. Mortal. Dead. The randomness of Jody's death became slightly less random when I understood who Terry Dean Miller was. He was a predator who had attacked before and would attack again. Jody was not targeted because of anything she did or who she was. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and she encountered a monster who was hunting for victims. It was horrible, but there was a kind of clarity in that horrible truth. I visited Jody's grave for the first time in years after the identification was announced. I brought flowers, purple ones because that had been her favorite color. I stood in the soft spring rain and told her what had happened. I told her that we knew his name now. I told her that he was dead. I told her that her story had helped catch other killers, had inspired other families to keep pushing for answers, had contributed to a revolution in forensic science that would save lives for generations to come. I told her I was sorry I couldn't have done more. Sorry I wasn't with her that day. Sorry the world had failed to protect her. And then I told her goodbye. Not a permanent goodbye, just a goodbye for now. Because I know I will carry her with me for the rest of my life. She is part of me, woven into the fabric of who I am, as much a part of my story as my own experiences and memories. The healing has continued since then. I started a scholarship in Jody's name, funding education for young women who want to pursue careers in forensic science or criminal justice. Every year, I meet the recipients, hear their stories, and see the passion in their eyes. They are the future. They are the ones who will solve the cases that are still cold, who will develop new technologies, who will ensure that monsters like Terry Dean Miller can never hide for so long again. I also work with cold case advocacy groups, sharing Jody's story and using it to inspire others who are still waiting for answers. I tell them not to give up. I tell them that science is advancing every day. I tell them that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. I believe that. After everything I've seen, after everything I've lived through, I still believe that justice is possible. Maybe not always in our lifetimes. Maybe not always in the way we expect, but possible. I began this story with a promise. A promise made by a 12-year-old girl standing in her best friend's empty bedroom, swearing that she would never forget, that she would never stop asking questions, that the truth would come out. It took 50 years, but I kept that promise. Jody Loomis was 11 years old when she died. She loved horses, wrote letters to presidents, and had a gap between her front teeth that made her smile unique. She was smart, kind, and full of the boundless energy that makes childhood so precious. She should have grown up. She should have had a career and a family and grandchildren who called her by silly nicknames. She should have lived. Instead, she became a name in a cold case file, a photograph that faded over time, a memory that fewer and fewer people shared as the years passed. But she was not forgotten. She was never forgotten. And now, because of the work of countless investigators, scientists, advocates, and family members who refuse to give up, her story has an ending. Not the ending she deserved, not the long life that was stolen from her, but an ending nonetheless. Her killer has been named. His other victims have been identified. His legacy is one of shame and exposure, not silence and mystery. That is Jody's victory. That is her family's victory. That is the victory of everyone who ever fought for justice in this case. And it is a reminder to every family still waiting, still hoping, still praying for answers. Your time may come. Science is advancing. Cold cases are being solved at a rate unprecedented in human history. The killers who thought they had escaped are being dragged into the light, one by one, their crimes exposed decades after they committed them. Terry Dean Miller thought he had gotten away with murder. He lived 46 years after killing Jody Loomis, never facing arrest, never sitting in a courtroom, never hearing a jury pronounce him guilty. By the measures of traditional justice, he escaped. But he did not escape. Not really. Because his name is now forever linked to his crimes. Because his DNA betrayed him in death as it could not in life. Because the little girl he killed in 1972 became the catalyst for a movement that has solved hundreds of other cases and will solve hundreds more. Jody Ann Loomis did not die in vain. Her death, as tragic and senseless as it was, has meaning. Her story has power. Her memory lives on. And that, more than anything, is what I want you to take from this story. The darkness does not get the final word. The monsters do not always win. Time, which once protected killers, now exposes them. And the love we carry for those we have lost, that fierce, unrelenting love that refuses to let them be forgotten, is stronger than death itself. I made a promise to Jody 50 years ago. Today, standing in the light of truth, I can finally say that promise has been fulfilled. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think about justice, or memory, or the people you carry in your heart, I ask you to share it. Subscribe to this channel so that more stories like Jody's can be told. Leave a comment telling me what this story meant to you. Because the more people who know, the more pressure there is to solve the cases that remain unsolved. The more resources are devoted to bringing killers to justice. Jody Loomis was supposed to be home before dark on March 31st, 1972. She never made it. But her light, the light of her memory and her story, shines brighter now than ever before. Rest in peace, Jody. We found him. We finally found him. And we will never forget.